You're nobody here. Stick to carrying plates.
Then someone should check page 47.
12 attorneys reviewed this. You think they missed something?
I think someone should check.
How many billion-dollar acquisitions have you completed?
None. That doesn't change the numbers.
What exactly are the numbers telling you?
Who controls what Meridian is selling you?
You believe there's a problem. Show us.
I need the ownership schedule and licensing appendix.
Something wrong?
Do you have the schedule referenced here?
So we've discovered a missing attachment?
The document controlling your best asset is missing. Nobody brought the document that controls your biggest asset.
Find Schedule 7C.
You're nobody in this room, sweetheart. So do yourself a favor and stick to carrying plates. Richard Whitmore said it without raising his voice. He didn't have to. The words traveled across the private dining room of Manhattan's Sterling House with the effortless cruelty of something spoken by a man who had never expected consequences. A fork stopped halfway to a mouth. A crystal glass hovered above white linen. Even the soft piano drifting from beyond the mahogany doors suddenly seemed too loud. 22 people sat around the table, including investment bankers, corporate attorneys, board members, and men whose signatures could move hundreds of millions of dollars before breakfast. Yet every pair of eyes had turned toward the young black waitress standing beside Richard's chair. Maya Brooks didn't move. At 25, she had already learned that silence could mean many things. Fear, restraint, calculation. Tonight, Richard mistook hers for surrender. He leaned back in his chair, handsome at 52, silver beginning to touch his dark hair, his tailored charcoal suit fitting the image magazines loved to print beside words like visionary and titan. On the table before him waited the final documents for a $2 billion acquisition that was supposed to become the defining victory of his career. Maya held a silver tray against her red apron. Her warm brown eyes lowered toward the papers for only a second. That second mattered. Richard had noticed her looking at page 47 while setting down his sparkling water. She had quietly said, "Sir, you may want your counsel to check that figure again." That was all. No accusation. No performance. Just 11 words. Richard had laughed. Now everyone else was expected to laugh with him. A few did. Most stared at their plates. Maya looked back at the document. One number appeared twice under two different ownership schedules. Same asset. Different controlling entities. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe there wasn't. But Richard Whitmore was minutes away from signing, and nobody at the table seemed interested in checking. "Mr. Whitmore," Maya said calmly, "I wasn't trying to embarrass you." His smile tightened. "Embarrass me?" He glanced around the table as though sharing a private joke with the entire room. "You're serving dinner at a meeting you don't understand." Maya's manager stood near the door, pale and motionless. Richard tapped the contract with one finger. "There are 12 attorneys involved in this transaction. 3 investment banks. Hundreds of analysts. And you think you spotted something they didn't?" Maya met his eyes. "I think someone should check." The laughter disappeared. Richard studied her for a moment, perhaps waiting for an apology. None came. "Do you even know what this deal is worth?" he asked. $2 billion. That answer came too quickly. Richard's CFO, Daniel Mercer, looked up. Maya noticed. So did Richard. "Interesting," Richard said. "Our waitress has been listening." "I didn't need to listen." Maya's gaze returned to page 47. "The number is printed right there." Daniel shifted in his chair. For the first time that evening, someone other than Maya seemed uncomfortable for a reason that had nothing to do with Richard's temper. Richard closed the folder. "Enough." Maya nodded once. She lifted her tray and stepped away. She could have left it there. She probably should have. But after 3 steps, she stopped. The room waited. Maya turned back toward the billionaire who had just called her nobody. Her voice remained gentle. "Mr. Whitmore, if that's what you believe, then you probably shouldn't care that you're about to lose $2 billion. Nobody laughed this time. Before we continue, if you enjoy unforgettable stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary moments, subscribe to Hidden Tables. Every story reminds us that true character is revealed through courage, compassion, and the choices we make when no one is watching. Now, let's see what happens next. 45 minutes earlier, Maya Brooks had entered the Sterling house through a narrow employee hallway that smelled faintly of roasted coffee, fresh bread, and lemon cleaner. Manhattan was already glowing beyond the restaurant windows, thousands of lights suspended above streets crowded with taxis and late commuters. Inside, everything moved with quieter precision. White tablecloths, polished silver, low amber lighting, conversations measured in millions. Maya tied her bright red apron, checked her black name tag, and pulled her natural curls into the high ponytail she wore for every shift. She had been called in because another server was sick. To her, it was supposed to be 6 ordinary hours, enough tips to cover groceries, utilities, and another payment toward the tuition balance she still carried from college. Then her manager, Thomas Reed, appeared beside the service station looking as nervous as Maya had ever seen him. "Private room tonight," he said. "Whitmore Dynamics. Major acquisition dinner. Keep everything quiet and professional." Maya nodded. "Understood." Thomas lowered his voice. "Richard Whitmore is particular." Maya almost smiled. In restaurants like Sterling House, particular usually meant everyone else had to pretend arrogance was a personality trait. She collected a tray of sparkling water and followed Thomas through the mahogany doors. That was when she saw it. Not Richard, not the lawyers, not the expensive watches surrounding the table. The logo, a small silver emblem printed at the bottom of a leather document folder beside Daniel Mercer, Richard's chief financial officer. Maya's steps slowed for less than a second. A circle crossed by 3 narrow lines. Most people would have ignored it. Maya could not. She had seen that mark before, years ago, stamped into the corner of old financial papers her father kept locked inside a wooden box at home. Brooks Strategic Holdings. At least, that was the name she remembered. Her father had rarely discussed it. Whenever Maya asked, his answer was always the same. Some doors stay closed for a reason. She had stopped asking by the time she was 16, but she had never forgotten the symbol. Maya placed the first glass beside Daniel, then another beside Richard. She kept her expression neutral. Whatever connection existed between her father's papers and this dinner was none of her business. She was working, nothing more. Yet as she moved around the table, fragments of conversation reached her. Intellectual property, licensing rights, acquisition structure, $2 billion. Those words awakened a part of Maya she had spent years trying to put away. Before leaving college, she had studied financial engineering. Numbers had always made sense to her because numbers followed rules even when people did not. She could look at a balance sheet and see relationships other people needed spreadsheets to notice. But talent did not pay tuition when life changed unexpectedly, and dreams could become expensive very quickly. So Maya had traded lecture halls for restaurant floors. She did not resent the work. She resented only the assumption that the uniform had erased everything she knew before she put it on. On her second trip into the room, Richard never looked at her face. "More water," he said, sliding his glass toward the edge without interrupting his conversation. Maya refilled it. Across the table, Daniel opened the folder bearing that familiar silver emblem. A page shifted underneath his hand. Maya caught only a glimpse. 2 company names. 1 licensing schedule. A percentage that seemed strangely familiar. She looked away immediately. Coincidence, she told herself. Then Eleanor Grant, an elderly investor seated near the far end, noticed Maya staring at the emblem. Their eyes met. Eleanor's expression changed. Not recognition exactly. Something closer to a question. Maya continued toward the service door. Behind her, Richard said, "Daniel, once we sign tonight, nobody can touch this deal." Maya's hand reached the brass door handle. She stopped for half a heartbeat. Nobody. The word would sound very different before the night was over. Richard Whitmore had built his reputation on a simple belief. Every room had a hierarchy, and the smartest person was usually the one powerful enough to define it. At 52, he had spent nearly 3 decades proving that philosophy to investors, competitors, employees, and anyone unfortunate enough to stand between him and an opportunity. Whitmore Dynamics had begun with 12 employees in a rented office outside Boston. Now it occupied glass towers in 4 American cities, employed more than 18,000 people, and carried Richard's name into industries ranging from artificial intelligence infrastructure to advanced logistics. Business magazines called him relentless. Shareholders called him brilliant. Employees used quieter words when the conference room doors were closed. Richard did not consider himself cruel. Cruelty, in his mind, required emotion. He simply believed efficiency mattered more than feelings. That evening at Sterling House, efficiency meant completing the acquisition before midnight. The company Whitmore Dynamics, intended to purchase, owned a portfolio of predictive logistics technology Richard believed could transform his empire. His advisors had spent 6 months preparing the transaction. Hundreds of pages had been reviewed. Numbers had been modeled and modeled again. The final price was enormous, but Richard liked enormous numbers. They made ordinary people nervous. They made him comfortable. Once the signatures are finished, we announce Monday morning, he told Daniel Mercer. By noon, every competitor we have will understand they waited too long. Daniel gave a careful nod. Unlike Richard, he did not enjoy celebrating before documents were signed. There are still several licensing schedules counsel wants confirmed. Richard barely looked at him. They have been confirmed. They have been reviewed. Same difference. Daniel did not answer. Across the room, Maya entered carrying the next course. Richard continued speaking as though the staff were moving furniture. The market rewards people who act while everyone else is still asking permission. Maya placed a plate before Eleanor Grant. Eleanor thanked her by name. Richard noticed and gave a faint smile. Eleanor, you remember everyone's name. Only the people who introduced themselves, Eleanor replied. You should try it. A few guests smiled carefully. Richard ignored the remark. Maya continued around the table. She was nearly finished when one of the attorneys mentioned a licensing entity called Northstar Intellectual Holdings. Maya's hand paused above a water glass. Barely noticeable. Barely. Daniel noticed. Eleanor did too. Richard did not. Northstar retains certain legacy rights, the attorney explained, but operational control transfers at closing. Certain rights? Daniel asked. Defined in Appendix 14. Richard exhaled. We have covered this. Maya stepped away, but the words followed her toward the service station. Northstar. She knew that name. Not from college. From home. Her father, Marcus Brooks, had once received envelopes carrying that exact name. Thick envelopes he never opened at the kitchen table. When Maya was 17, she had asked whether Northstar was his employer. Marcus had gone strangely quiet before saying, It belongs to a part of our family history that I chose to leave behind. She remembered something else now. The silver emblem on those envelopes had been identical to the one on Daniel's folder. Maya returned to the dining room with coffee. Richard was telling a story about acquiring a smaller company years earlier. They thought they had leverage, he said. Everyone thinks they have leverage until they meet someone who can afford to wait longer. Maya set his cup down. Black. No sugar, Richard said, still without looking at her. Yes, sir. See, Richard said to the table. Everyone has a role. Problems start when people forget it. Maya's eyes moved briefly toward Appendix 14. Richard finally noticed. This time his expression hardened. Is there something fascinating about my paperwork? Maya held his gaze. I hope not, sir. Daniel stopped turning pages. Eleanor leaned back slowly. Richard smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Good answer. Maya walked toward the door, carrying an empty tray. Behind her, Daniel opened Appendix 14. His eyes moved down the page, then stopped. For the first time that night, the chief financial officer did not look cautious. He looked concerned. Daniel Mercer read the paragraph twice. Then a third time. The language itself was ordinary enough to disappear inside a transaction this large. Licensing rights, conditional assignments, controlling interests, transfer provisions. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that should have made the chief financial officer of Whitmore Dynamics press his thumb against the edge of the page and stare at it, as if the paper had suddenly changed. Daniel? Richard asked. Daniel looked up. I want counsel to confirm something in Appendix 14. Richard's expression tightened. We confirmed it this afternoon. I know. Then why are we discussing it again? Daniel hesitated. Around Richard, hesitation was treated almost like an admission of incompetence. Because Northstar appears in the licensing schedule and the ownership schedule under different classifications. Richard leaned back. Different classifications do not mean different ownership. Correct. Daniel looked down again. But I would like confirmation. Richard gave him a thin smile. Then confirm it and let us move forward. Conversation resumed, but Maya could feel the temperature of the room changing as she returned with a tray of coffee. She had spent enough time around wealthy guests to recognize the moment confidence became performance. Voices grew slightly louder. Smiles lasted slightly longer. People who were certain rarely needed everyone else to know it. She placed a cup beside Daniel and saw the page from the corner of her eye. Northstar Intellectual Holdings appeared in one column. Meridian Licensing Partners appeared in another. Beneath both sat a reference to the same patent family. Maya kept moving. One table. Two entities. One asset. Something did not fit. She had learned to notice patterns long before college. Marcus Brooks used to turn grocery receipts into lessons at their kitchen table. He would circle 3 numbers and ask which one did not belong. Later came annual reports, debt schedules, ownership charts. Never stare at the biggest number, he would tell her. Look for the small number everyone assumes is harmless. At 19, Maya entered college believing she would eventually work in quantitative finance. She loved the clean logic of models, the way a complicated structure could reveal itself if you asked the right question. Then life became less clean. Her mother lost her job. Bills accumulated. Marcus refused help from relatives Maya had never met. Tuition became impossible. Maya left school with 2 semesters unfinished and promised herself the departure was temporary. 3 years later, temporary had become a red apron and double shifts. But knowledge did not vanish because a degree remained unfinished. Maya returned to the service station, where Thomas Reed was checking dessert orders. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Yes." She paused. "Do you know what company they are buying?" Thomas gave her a warning look. "Maya, I am only asking. Do not get involved. That room pays more for one dinner than this restaurant makes on a normal Tuesday." Maya nodded. Thomas was not insulting her. He was afraid. In places built around powerful people, fear often dressed itself as professionalism. She picked up a water pitcher and returned to the private room. Daniel was now speaking quietly with 2 attorneys. Richard watched them with visible irritation. Maya approached Eleanor Grant's seat. Eleanor turned slightly toward her. "You recognize that emblem, do you not?" Maya nearly spilled nothing, but her hand tightened around the pitcher. "I am sorry." Eleanor glanced toward Daniel's leather folder. "The silver mark." Maya's face remained calm. "I have seen something similar." Eleanor studied her name tag. "Maya Brooks." Her eyes narrowed with sudden curiosity. "Brooks," she repeated softly. Before Maya could answer, Richard's voice crossed the table. "Is my staff meeting interrupting the beverage service?" Several faces turned. Maya straightened. "No, sir." Richard pointed toward his glass. "Then water." Maya filled it without another word. As she stepped away, Daniel spoke from across the table. "Richard, we may have a problem." The room quieted. Richard did not look at Daniel first. He looked at Maya. "We may have a problem" was not a sentence Richard Whitmore enjoyed hearing, especially when $2 billion and half a year of negotiations were sitting beneath his fingertips. His eyes remained on Maya for another second before returning to Daniel. "What problem?" Daniel rotated the document toward one of the attorneys. "The patent portfolio is listed as an operating asset of Meridian Systems, but Appendix 14 references Northstar Intellectual Holdings as the controlling licensor." Richard frowned. "We already know Northstar exists." "Yes, but this language may give Northstar continuing approval rights after closing." The lead attorney, Caroline Hayes, adjusted her glasses and leaned closer. "May is doing a lot of work in that sentence, Daniel. The provision could simply be legacy language." "Then confirm it," Richard said. Caroline nodded and began reviewing the supporting pages. Richard looked around the table, clearly irritated that momentum had been interrupted. Then his attention returned to Maya. She was collecting an empty coffee cup from Eleanor's place. "Interesting timing," he said. Maya stopped. "Excuse me, sir? You spend the evening staring at documents that do not concern you. And suddenly my chief financial officer discovers a concern." Daniel immediately spoke. "Richard, this came from my review. I know where it came from." Richard smiled toward the guests. "I am merely impressed by our unusually attentive beverage service." A few people gave uncertain laughs. Maya kept her voice even. "I was not trying to interfere." No, sir." "Then perhaps you can explain why you keep looking at the paperwork." Thomas stood near the door, his expression asking Maya to say nothing. She could have apologized. She could have walked away. Instead, she glanced toward the open schedule. "Because the same intellectual property appears to be connected to 2 entities." Silence settled across the table. Richard stared at her. You determined that while pouring water? I noticed it while pouring water. Someone near the far end covered a smile. Richard heard the difference. His face hardened by a fraction. Apparently our waitress audits acquisitions now. This time the laughter came more easily. Not from everyone. Daniel did not laugh. Eleanor did not move. Maya simply held the empty cup in one hand. Richard continued. Tell me, Miss Brooks, how many billion-dollar acquisitions have you completed? None. How many corporate mergers? None. How many years have you practiced law? I have not practiced law. Richard spread his hands toward the room. There we are. Maya looked at the documents again. That does not change the numbers. The laughter vanished. Richard leaned forward. And what exactly do you think the numbers are telling you? Maya considered her answer carefully. That everyone is focused on who owns Meridian Systems. I would be more interested in who controls what Meridian Systems is selling you. Daniel's eyes shifted immediately to Caroline. Caroline stopped turning pages. Richard noticed both reactions. For the first time, his amusement required effort. You are making an extraordinary assumption from a document you have barely seen. That is why I said someone should check. Someone qualified. Yes. Maya nodded toward Daniel. Like your chief financial officer. Daniel lowered his eyes, but not before Richard saw the smallest trace of agreement. That bothered Richard more than Maya's words. Power was comfortable when everyone faced the same direction. The moment one person turned, the room could change. Miss Brooks, Richard said, I have paid experts more money for this transaction than most people earn in a lifetime. Maya answered softly. Then checking should be worth the price. Eleanor's mouth curved into the faintest smile. Thomas looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. Richard stared at Maya, no longer amused by the waitress with inconvenient questions. Bring the dessert, he said, and leave the finance to people who understand it. Maya nodded and turned toward the door. Before she reached it, Caroline spoke. Daniel. Everyone looked at her. Caroline had gone still over Appendix 14. I found the cross-reference. Richard's fingers stopped beside his coffee cup. Caroline looked up slowly. We need to review the ownership chain before anyone signs anything tonight. Maya did not turn around. But as she stepped through the mahogany doors, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The small number everyone had assumed was harmless had finally begun to speak. Behind the mahogany doors, Maya placed the empty coffee cup beside the service station and reached for the dessert tray, but Thomas Reed quietly moved in front of her. Maya, what are you doing? His voice was low enough that the kitchen staff could not hear. My job. Your job does not include reviewing a $2 billion acquisition. I did not review it. I noticed something. Thomas rubbed his forehead. Richard Whitmore could have this restaurant removed from every corporate event list in Manhattan with 3 telephone calls. Maya looked toward the closed doors. Would you rather they sign something that might be wrong? Thomas stared at her. I would rather you understand that people like him do not appreciate being corrected. Maya almost answered, but the doors opened before she could. Eleanor Grant stepped into the hallway. At 71, Eleanor carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who no longer needed permission to speak. Miss Brooks, she said. Thomas immediately straightened. Ms. Grant, is everything satisfactory? Perfectly. Eleanor kept her eyes on Maya. I only wanted a word with her. Thomas hesitated, then returned toward the kitchen. Eleanor waited until he was gone. Where have you seen that silver emblem? Maya tightened her grip on the dessert tray. On some old papers. What kind of papers? Family papers. Eleanor's expression sharpened. Your father's? Maya did not answer immediately. Why? Eleanor studied her face, then her name tag again. Because I knew a Marcus Brooks once. The name landed differently when spoken by a stranger. Maya's shoulders stiffened. A lot of people have that name. Not the Marcus Brooks I knew. Eleanor lowered her voice. He could read a corporate structure faster than most attorneys could read the first page. Maya felt the hallway become strangely small. My father never worked in corporate finance. Eleanor gave her a look that contained neither disbelief nor certainty. Is that what he told you? Before Maya could respond, Daniel appeared at the doorway. Miss Brooks, Richard wants you back inside. Eleanor's eyes stayed on Maya for one final second. We should finish this conversation later. Maya followed Daniel into the private room. The atmosphere had changed completely. Dessert plates remained untouched. Caroline Hayes had spread several documents across the table. Two attorneys were comparing schedules on their laptops. Richard stood near the window overlooking Manhattan, one hand in his pocket, his reflection floating against the city lights. He turned as Maya entered. Daniel tells me you recognized a discrepancy before my legal team did. I recognized a pattern. From a few seconds beside the table? From several trips beside the table. Richard walked back to his chair. Explain the pattern. Maya glanced at Caroline. I would rather your counsel explain it. I am asking you. Maya placed the dessert tray on the sideboard. Northstar appears to control licensing rights connected to the same patent portfolio Meridian lists as a core acquisition asset. If those rights remain separate after closing, buying Meridian might not give you the control you think you are buying. Richard's expression barely moved. Might. Yes, sir. Might. That is why I suggested checking. Caroline spoke carefully. Her interpretation is possible, Richard, but we still need the complete ownership chain. Richard looked at Maya as though she were a puzzle he disliked needing to solve. Where did you learn to read agreements like this? College. Law school. No. Business school. Financial engineering. Daniel looked surprised. Where? Maya paused. Columbia. The room became quieter. Richard glanced at her uniform, then back at her face. You graduated from Columbia? No. I left before finishing. Something almost satisfied appeared in Richard's eyes, as though the missing degree restored the hierarchy he understood. Then perhaps we should remember the difference between education and expertise. Maya nodded. We should also remember the difference between confidence and certainty. Eleanor lowered her eyes to hide a smile. Richard did not. He slowly closed the folder in front of him. All right, Miss Brooks. You clearly believe you see something everyone else missed. He pushed the folder toward the empty chair beside him. Let us find out how much that belief is worth. Richard left the folder resting beside the empty chair. No one spoke. The challenge was obvious, but Maya did not move toward it immediately. She looked at the leather cover, then at Richard. What exactly are you asking me to do? Richard folded his hands. You believe there is a problem. Show us. Thomas had returned to the doorway, and the concern on his face deepened. Maya could almost hear his earlier warning. People like Richard Whitmore did not appreciate being corrected, but another voice came back to her instead. Her father's. Marcus Brooks had never taught with textbooks when Maya was young. He taught with whatever was available. Grocery receipts, utility bills, newspaper business pages. Once, when she was 12, he placed 3 supermarket advertisements on their kitchen table and asked which store had the cheapest cereal. Maya pointed at the lowest price. Marcus shook his head. That is the number they want you to see. He made her calculate package sizes, discounts, and unit prices until she found the real answer. Then he smiled. Never let the biggest number distract you from the smallest condition. Years later, his lessons became harder. Annual reports, debt structures, licensing agreements, ownership diagrams drawn on yellow legal pads. Maya never understood why a man who claimed to have left corporate life behind knew so much about the machinery of money. Whenever she asked, Marcus simply said, knowing how power works does not mean you have to worship it. At Columbia, Maya discovered that what her father had taught her had names. Quantitative modeling, risk analysis, corporate valuation. She loved all of it. But when family finances collapsed, she chose rent over tuition and responsibility over pride. Leaving school hurt. It did not erase what she had learned. Now, standing in Sterling House with a red apron tied around her waist, Maya understood something Richard did not. He saw an unfinished degree. She saw unfinished work. I would need the ownership schedule, she said. Richard raised an eyebrow. Caroline slid several pages toward the empty chair. And the intellectual property licensing appendix, Maya added. Caroline supplied that too. Richard gestured toward the seat. Please, educate us. Maya remained standing. I can read from here. Eleanor watched her carefully. Daniel leaned forward. Maya traced one line with her eyes, then another. Meridian Systems owned the operating company. Meridian listed the patent portfolio among its core assets. But Northstar held exclusive licensing authority over several technologies inside that portfolio. That alone was unusual, not necessarily fatal. The real question was who controlled Northstar. Maya turned a page, then another. There it was. A reference number. Small, almost forgettable. Her pulse changed. She had seen that numbering format before on documents Marcus kept in the wooden box. Richard noticed her pause. Something wrong. I am not sure yet. That sounds less confident. Maya ignored the remark. Do you have the schedule referenced here? Caroline searched her files. Schedule 7C? Yes. Caroline typed into her laptop, frowned, then checked again. It is not included in this packet. Daniel looked at her. Why not? It may be in the supplemental data room. Richard exhaled sharply. So after all this, we have discovered a missing attachment? Maya looked directly at him. No, sir. Richard's smile returned. Then what have we discovered? Maya tapped the reference number once. That the document controlling your most valuable asset is the one document nobody brought to the table. The room went silent. Daniel opened his laptop immediately. Richard stared at Maya. What had begun as amusement was becoming something else. Not respect. Not yet. It was uncertainty. And for a man who had built an empire by making other people uncertain first, the feeling was unfamiliar. Find Schedule 7C, Richard said. Daniel began searching. Maya stepped away from the chair. Eleanor's eyes followed her. Then, very quietly, she asked, Did Marcus teach you to look for missing schedules? Maya turned. Eleanor already knew the answer. Daniel searched the supplemental data room while the entire table waited. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. The quiet felt heavier with every click of his keyboard. Richard remained perfectly still, but Maya noticed the muscle near his jaw tighten when Daniel finally said, I found Schedule 7C. Caroline moved her chair closer. Open it. Daniel entered his credentials, waited for the document to load, then scanned the first page. His expression changed almost immediately. Well, Richard asked. Daniel looked toward Caroline. Northstar retains exclusive licensing authority over the primary predictive logistics patents. Caroline leaned over the screen. That is consistent with what we already knew. Richard's shoulders relaxed. Exactly. He turned toward Maya with the faint satisfaction of a man watching order return to the universe. So we have spent 15 minutes proving that my attorneys can, in fact, read. A few nervous smiles appeared around the table. Maya said nothing. Daniel continued scrolling. There is more. Richard's smile faded again. What? The licensing authority is conditional. Caroline read over his shoulder. Transfer, sublicensing, material modification, or change of operational control requires written approval from the controlling interest of Northstar. Richard frowned. Meridian controls Northstar. That is what the seller represented, Daniel said. Then there is no problem. Maya looked at the screen. Who does Schedule 7C identify as Northstar's controlling interest? Daniel scrolled farther. His eyebrows drew together. It does not. Richard turned toward Maya. There. Your theory ends where the document ends. Maya remained calm. Not necessarily. Richard gave a humorless laugh. You have been wrong for nearly 20 minutes, Miss Brooks, and somehow each missing answer becomes another reason you might be right. Thomas shifted near the door. Eleanor watched without blinking. Richard stood. Let us make this simple. He pushed the leather folder across the table toward Maya. Find one actual mistake. Not a possibility. Not a missing attachment. One mistake my attorneys missed. Maya looked at him. And if I do, I will personally pay the remaining tuition for your degree. Several guests exchanged surprised glances. Richard continued before anyone could respond. And if you do not, you apologize to everyone at this table for wasting their time, and your manager removes you from this dinner immediately. Thomas stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, that is not necessary. Richard raised one hand. She wanted to enter the conversation. Now she can finish it. Maya studied his face. The offer sounded generous because Richard wanted it to sound generous. But generosity, given as humiliation, was merely another form of control. My job should not be part of a wager, she said. Afraid? No. I just prefer clear terms. Eleanor's eyes brightened. Richard crossed his arms. Fine. Your employment is your manager's decision. The tuition offer stands. Find the mistake. Maya moved toward the table. Daniel turned the laptop so she could see it. For several minutes, she read without speaking. Northstar. Meridian. Patent assignments. Voting rights. Licensing authority. The pieces seemed close, but not close enough. She searched for the reference number from the paper schedule. Nothing. She tried the Northstar registration identifier. Nothing. Richard checked his watch. Any revelation? Maya ignored him. Then Caroline pointed to a paragraph. Here. North Star became a wholly controlled Meridian subsidiary 6 years ago. Daniel read it and exhaled. That settles it. Richard looked at Maya. Apparently, the experts survived. Maya stared at the paragraph. For one painful second, she wondered whether she had connected memories that did not belong together. Perhaps the emblem meant nothing. Perhaps North Star had changed. Perhaps she had been wrong. Richard leaned toward her. I believe an apology is appropriate. Thomas lowered his eyes. Maya looked again at the sentence Caroline had found. 6 years ago. Something about it bothered her. Not the language. The date. She remembered her father's old envelopes. They had arrived much more recently than 6 years ago. Maya reached for the ownership schedule. Wait. Richard sighed. Miss Brooks. You are checking the wrong company. Daniel stopped moving. Maya placed 2 pages side by side. Meridian may control the North Star subsidiary listed here. But this licensing agreement does not name that entity. Caroline leaned closer. Maya pointed to the registration numbers. They are different. Daniel's face went pale. Maya looked at Richard. There are 2 North Stars, and you are buying the one that does not control the patents. Daniel Mercer stared at the 2 registration numbers until the difference became impossible to ignore. One ended in 42. The other ended in 79. Same name, same branding, different legal entities. Caroline Hayes pulled the laptop closer and opened the state registration records linked inside the data room. North Star Intellectual Holdings, Delaware registration ending in 42, is the Meridian subsidiary, she said. Her finger moved down the screen. But the licensing agreement identifies North Star Intellectual Holdings Trust Company, registration ending in 79. Richard remained standing. What does that mean? Caroline did not answer immediately. Daniel did. It means Meridian owns the company with the familiar name, but another entity controls the licensing authority attached to the patents. The room became completely still. Richard looked from Daniel to Caroline, then finally to Maya. Verify it. Daniel was already working. He opened the intellectual property schedule, then the patent assignment history, then a supplemental licensing memorandum buried beneath dozens of files. Maya watched the structure unfold exactly as her father had taught her to read it. Do not follow the biggest number. Follow the smallest condition. Daniel whispered, There it is. Caroline leaned closer. Read it. Daniel swallowed. The predictive logistics patents remain subject to an exclusive master license controlled by North Star Trust Company. Meridian possesses operating rights, but those rights do not automatically transfer after a change in control. Richard's face lost its practiced confidence. We are buying Meridian. Change of control is the entire transaction. Exactly, Maya said. Richard turned toward her. No one laughed. Daniel continued. If North Star refuses consent, Whitmore Dynamics could own Meridian without having guaranteed long-term control of the technology that justifies most of the purchase price. Richard slowly sat down. $2 billion had sounded powerful an hour earlier. Now it sounded like exposure. How did our diligence team miss this? He asked. Caroline answered carefully. The seller grouped both North Star entities under abbreviated references throughout several schedules. Most of the documents use only North Star. Most, Richard repeated. Not all. Maya pointed toward the registration identifiers. The numbers were there. They were just separated across different documents. Daniel looked at her with open disbelief. You caught that from the service side of the table? I caught the pattern. The documents confirmed it. Richard said nothing. Maya could see him searching for an explanation that restored the world he understood. Luck. Coincidence. Insider information. Anything except the simplest possibility. The young woman he had dismissed had seen what an expensive room full of experts had overlooked. Daniel began calculating on a legal pad. If the license is not transferable, Meridian's valuation changes dramatically. We would need a new model before signing anything. How dramatically? Richard asked. Daniel hesitated. Potentially hundreds of millions. Possibly more, depending on the remaining patent life and North Star's consent terms. Eleanor Grant finally spoke. So she did not merely find a mistake. She looked toward Richard. She prevented you from signing before you understood what you were buying. Richard's eyes remained on Maya. You studied this at Columbia? Parts of it. For how long? 2 years. And you expect me to believe 2 years of unfinished coursework allowed you to see what 12 attorneys missed. Maya's expression changed, not with anger, but disappointment. No, sir. I expect you to believe the registration numbers are different. Eleanor almost smiled. Daniel did not bother hiding his. Richard looked away first. Caroline closed one document and opened another. There is still a larger question. What question? Richard asked. Who controls Northstar Trust Company? Daniel searched the ownership records. A minute passed. Then another. The public filing led to a private holding structure, which led to a trust administrator, which led nowhere visible. The beneficial owner is not disclosed here, Daniel said. Maya felt a chill of recognition when she saw the trust identification code on his screen. She knew that code too. It had appeared on the envelopes Marcus kept inside the wooden box. Eleanor saw Maya's face change. You recognize that one as well? She said softly. Richard heard her. His attention snapped back to Maya. What exactly do you know about Northstar? Maya looked at the screen, then at Eleanor. The answer she had spent years not asking about was suddenly sitting 10 feet away. Less than I should, she said. Daniel clicked into one final document. At the bottom was a contact designation for the controlling trust. Eleanor leaned forward and went completely still. Richard, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You need to stop this transaction. Richard frowned. Why? Eleanor looked at Maya Brooks before answering. Because I think I know who owns the company you actually need. You think you know who controls Northstar? Richard asked. Eleanor Grant did not answer immediately. She kept her eyes on the contact designation at the bottom of Daniel's screen, where a string of letters and numbers had transformed a business dinner into something far more complicated. I recognize the structure, Eleanor said. That is not the same as knowing the current beneficiary. Richard's patience thinned. Then tell me what you recognize. Eleanor leaned back. Brooks Family Stewardship Trust. The name seemed ordinary when spoken aloud. Maya felt anything but ordinary hearing it. Daniel looked from the screen to Maya's black name tag. Brooks. Richard noticed the movement. Do not tell me we are making conclusions because two people share a common last name. We are not, Eleanor said. Not yet. Maya stood beside the table, suddenly aware of every sound in the room. The low hum of the ventilation. A coffee spoon touching porcelain. Traffic far below the windows. For years, Marcus had refused to discuss the relatives he had left behind. Maya knew there had been money once. She knew there had been arguments. She knew her father preferred a modest apartment and an old sedan to whatever life he had walked away from. But $10 billion trusts and control of major technology licenses belonged to another universe. Maya, Eleanor said gently, did your father ever mention Samuel Brooks? Maya's breath caught. My grandfather's name is Samuel. Richard looked at her sharply. Your grandfather? I have never met him. Convenient, Richard said. Eleanor's expression hardened. Careful, Richard. But Richard had already found the explanation his pride preferred. A waitress recognizes confidential structures connected to a private trust. Her father apparently knew corporate finance. Her grandfather may be connected to the entity holding leverage over my transaction. He looked directly at Maya. That is an extraordinary collection of coincidences. Maya understood what he was suggesting. I did not know Northstar was involved until tonight. Yet you recognized its documents. I recognized a logo and a numbering format from papers my father kept at home. Papers you had access to. Daniel interrupted. Richard, nothing she identified required private information. The registration numbers are in our own diligence files. Richard ignored him. How did you know where to look? Maya's voice stayed calm. Because your documents did not match. That is not an answer. It is the only answer I have. Richard stood and walked toward the window. His reflection looked smaller against Manhattan now. Caroline, if there is any possibility confidential information reached this room improperly, I want it documented. Caroline did not move. There is no evidence of that. I said document the possibility. Eleanor's chair moved softly against the carpet as she stood. She just prevented you from signing a transaction your own team did not fully understand, and your first instinct is to accuse her of cheating. Richard turned. My first instinct is to protect my company. No, Eleanor said. Your first instinct is to protect your certainty. The words landed harder because no one laughed. Maya looked at Richard and finally saw the shape of his fear. He could accept losing money. He could accept a difficult negotiation. What he could not accept was being wrong about someone he had already decided was beneath him. Daniel returned to the ownership search. There is another layer. He opened a trust administration record. Northstar Trust Company cannot approve a transfer independently. Any change of control requires consent from the Brooks Family Stewardship Trust. Richard walked back to the table. Who has consent authority? Daniel read silently. His eyes widened. The trust's managing principal. Name. The current public record does not list one. It gives a representative office in Boston. Eleanor shook her head slowly. That was Samuel's office. Maya looked at her. You knew my grandfather? Eleanor's face softened. 30 years ago, before your father left. Maya felt the floor beneath her shoes, solid and familiar, while everything else seemed to shift. Richard studied her again, but this time there was calculation behind his eyes. If Samuel Brooks is your grandfather, prove it. Maya reached into her pocket for her phone, then stopped. She had spent years respecting her father's silence. Calling a stranger because a billionaire demanded proof felt wrong. Richard mistook the hesitation. Exactly. Maya looked up. Exactly what? You cannot prove it. Maya's warm brown eyes became steady. I should not have to prove my family to prove your paperwork is wrong. Daniel lowered his gaze. Eleanor smiled faintly. Richard opened his mouth, but Caroline spoke first. She is right. The transaction is paused regardless of who her grandfather is. Richard turned toward the attorneys. Control was slipping away one decision at a time. Daniel's phone suddenly vibrated across the table. He looked at the screen and froze. What? Richard demanded. Daniel answered slowly. The seller just received notice from Northstar. Richard's face changed. What notice? Daniel looked toward Maya before reading the message. Consent to the acquisition has been withheld. Effective immediately. The message from Northstar changed the room faster than any argument could. Daniel read it again, slower this time, as though the words might rearrange themselves if given another chance. They did not. Consent had been withheld. The acquisition could not proceed under the terms Richard had spent 6 months negotiating. $2 billion remained unsigned on the table. Richard reached for Daniel's phone. When was this sent? 3 minutes ago. Who requested the review? Daniel scrolled. It does not say. Richard looked immediately at Maya. 3 minutes. Maya understood before he finished. I did not contact anyone. You expect me to believe that? My phone has been in my pocket. That proves nothing. Eleanor's voice sharpened. Richard. He ignored her. You recognize the trust. You recognize Northstar. Your father apparently had access to its documents. Now, the exact moment you question my transaction, consent disappears. Maya stood perfectly still. I told you what I know. Then tell me what you are not telling me. The room had seen Richard irritated. Now they were seeing something more revealing. A man trying to rebuild control by turning uncertainty into accusation. Maya reached into her pocket and placed her phone on the table. Check it. Richard blinked. What? My call history. My messages. Check everything since I walked into this restaurant. Caroline immediately said, that is unnecessary. I know, Maya replied. Her eyes never left Richard. But apparently facts are only valuable here when they protect the right person. Silence. Daniel looked away. Eleanor did not. Richard stared at the phone but did not touch it. Maya continued. You asked how I knew where to look. My father taught me. You asked why I recognized Northstar. I saw the name on documents at home. You asked whether Samuel Brooks is my grandfather. Yes, that is the name my father gave me. I have not spoken to him. I have never met him. That is everything I know. Richard's expression remained skeptical. And I am supposed to accept that? Maya slowly picked up her phone. No. You are supposed to accept that your own attorneys confirmed the problem before anyone knew my grandfather's name. That landed. Caroline closed her laptop halfway. She is correct. Daniel nodded. The licensing discrepancy exists independently of her family connection. Richard looked around the table and found no support. Eleanor finally stepped closer. You want proof because you still think her value must come from somewhere you recognize. A university degree. A wealthy family. A title. Anything except her. Richard said nothing. Maya looked toward Eleanor. You said you knew my father. I did. Then tell me why he left. Eleanor hesitated. That is his story to tell. He is not here. Eleanor's face softened. Marcus believed the family had forgotten the difference between stewardship and control. He walked away from money most people would spend their lives chasing. Maya absorbed the words quietly. Suddenly, the old apartment, the second-hand furniture, the careful grocery budgets, and her father's refusal to call relatives made a different kind of sense. Richard interrupted. None of this tells us who withheld consent. Maya turned toward him. Then stop asking me and ask the person who can answer. Who? Maya looked down at the contact information on Daniel's screen. Boston, Brooks Family Stewardship Trust. A name from childhood that had always belonged to silence. She had spent years honoring her father's decision not to open that door. But Richard had accused her of manipulating a transaction she had just helped save. If truth was going to enter this room, Maya wanted all of it. Call my grandfather. No one moved. Richard's expression changed. You just said you have never met him. I have not. Then how exactly do you expect to reach him? Eleanor reached into her handbag and removed her phone. I can. Maya looked at her. Eleanor held her gaze. Samuel and I have not spoken in years, but I still have his private office number. Richard gave a skeptical laugh. This is becoming absurd. Eleanor dialed. The room waited through one ring. Then two. Then three. A man's voice answered. Eleanor's expression changed immediately. Samuel, it is Eleanor Grant. A pause. Yes, it has been a very long time. She looked at Maya. I am sitting in Manhattan with a young woman named Maya Brooks. Silence came through the speaker. Even Richard could hear it. Then the man's voice returned, quieter now. Did you say Maya? Eleanor handed her the phone. Maya held it carefully. Yes, sir. Another pause. Then Samuel Brooks said the words that erased the last trace of doubt in the room. Marcus's daughter. Maya swallowed. Yes. Samuel's voice softened. My granddaughter. Richard Whitmore stopped breathing for a beat. Maya looked directly at him. The waitress he had demanded prove herself was no longer the person with something to explain. He was my granddaughter. Samuel Brooks said the words without drama, yet they carried more weight than anything Richard Whitmore had said all evening. Maya held Eleanor's phone close to her ear, unsure whether to answer as a waitress, as Marcus Brooks's daughter, or simply as a 25-year-old woman hearing her grandfather's voice for the first time. Yes, sir, she finally said. Samuel was quiet for a moment. You sound like your father. Maya swallowed. You cannot know that from 2 words. A soft laugh came through the speaker. That answer is exactly why I know. Eleanor smiled. Richard did not. Daniel and Caroline remained silent, waiting for the conversation to reach the question hanging over $2 billion. Samuel reached it first. You were calling about North Star. Maya looked at Daniel's screen. Did you withhold consent tonight? Yes. Richard stepped closer. Mr. Brooks, Richard Whitmore. I would like to understand on what basis your trust interfered with a transaction that has been under review for 6 months. Samuel's voice became colder, though never louder. Interfered is an interesting word. North Star owns licensing authority your acquisition requires. Consent was never automatic. Caroline nodded slowly. Richard asked, why was it withheld tonight? Because our compliance office received notice that Meridian intended to close before completing the required control review. That triggered an automatic hold. Maya looked at Richard. She had not caused it. She had not secretly called anyone. The process had already been moving. Samuel continued. Had your team signed first and investigated later, you would have purchased an operating company without secured control over several technologies central to your valuation. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The mistake was now undeniable. What is North Star worth? Richard asked. Eleanor looked at him with disappointment. Even now, he wanted a number. Samuel answered anyway. North Star is one asset inside Brooks Family Capital. The family structure currently oversees approximately $10 billion across technology, infrastructure, real estate, and long-term investment holdings. The room went still again. Richard's eyes moved toward Maya's red apron. $10 billion. The number changed how several people looked at her, and Maya noticed immediately. That bothered her more than Richard's earlier contempt. I do not have $10 billion, she said. Everyone turned toward her. Samuel answered gently. No one said you did. Maya looked around the table. Then nobody should start treating me differently because my grandfather manages it. Eleanor's smile widened. Samuel went quiet. Richard seemed almost confused. You are part of that family. Apparently. And you work here? Maya looked down at her name tag. Yes. Why? The question exposed him more clearly than an insult could. Maya answered, because this is my job. Richard had no response. Samuel spoke again. Marcus chose to leave the family structure before Maya was born. He disagreed with how wealth was shaping our decisions. He refused distributions, titles, and influence. I was angry with him for years. His voice softened. Eventually, pride became distance, and distance became time. Maya felt something tighten in her chest. He never told me the whole story. I imagine he wanted you to decide what you valued before money decided for you. Maya looked at the documents. Suddenly, her father's lessons made sense. He had not been preparing her to inherit wealth. He had been teaching her how not to be controlled by it. Richard cleared his throat. Mr. Brooks, can this transaction still proceed? Samuel paused. Not tonight. We can correct the documentation. Documentation is only one concern. Richard frowned. What is the other? Samuel's answer came calmly. Leadership. No one moved. A man responsible for thousands of employees was prepared to sign a $2 billion agreement without understanding who controlled its central assets. That concerns me, but I am more concerned by what I have heard about how he treated the person who noticed. Richard looked at Maya. For once, there was no clever reply waiting. Samuel continued. North Star will conduct a full review. Until then, consent remains withheld. Richard's shoulders lowered. The deal was stopped, not because Maya had used family influence, not because $10 billion had suddenly made her important. It was stopped because she had been right before anyone knew her name meant anything. Maya handed the phone back to Eleanor. Mr. Brooks, she said before letting go. Yes, Maya. If we ever talk again, I do not want it to be about money. Samuel was silent for a long moment. Neither do I. The call ended. Richard stared at the unsigned contract, then at Maya. Hours earlier, he had measured her worth by a uniform. Now the richest revelation in the room was not who her family was. It was how little that fact had mattered to what she had already proven. The unsigned contract remained on the table long after Samuel Brooks ended the call. No one rushed to gather it. No one spoke about dessert. The evening that Richard Whitmore had expected to end with champagne and congratulations now ended with lawyers closing laptops and investors quietly arranging cars home. Daniel Mercer collected the acquisition documents, but left page 47 in front of Richard. Perhaps intentionally, perhaps not. Maya returned to work. That surprised Richard more than anything else. She cleared coffee cups, thanked Eleanor, carried untouched plates toward the kitchen, and helped Thomas reset the room as though discovering a connection to a $10 billion family structure did not suddenly make ordinary work beneath her. Eleanor stopped beside Maya before leaving. Your father would be proud. Maya smiled gently. I think he would tell me I should have checked the second registration number sooner. Eleanor laughed. Yes, that sounds like Marcus. She handed Maya a card. When you are ready to learn more about your family, call me. Not because of the money. Maya accepted it. Thank you. Nearly 40 minutes later, Sterling House had become quiet. Manhattan still glittered beyond the windows, indifferent to failed acquisitions and wounded pride. Maya was wiping the final table when she heard footsteps behind her. Richard stood near the doorway without his attorneys, assistants, or audience. For the first time that evening, he looked less like the man who owned every room he entered and more like a man uncertain whether he deserved to remain in this one. Miss Brooks. Maya set the cloth down. Mr. Whitmore. He looked at the empty chairs. I owe you an apology. She waited. Richard seemed accustomed to statements being accepted before he finished making them. Maya gave him no such shortcut. What I said to you was disrespectful, he continued. Calling you nobody was unacceptable. Questioning your honesty after you identified the licensing problem was worse. Maya nodded once. It was. Richard absorbed the answer. You could have embarrassed me tonight. You did not need my help with that. He almost smiled, then realized she was not joking. Fair enough. He glanced toward the contract still resting at his place. You saved my company from making an extraordinarily expensive mistake. Your team confirmed it. After you found it. Richard paused. I meant what I said about your tuition. I will pay whatever remains. Maya shook her head. No. There are no conditions. There were when you offered it. Richard looked down. Then let me remove them. That does not remove the reason you offered. He was quiet. Maya continued. I will finish school. I will pay for it the way I choose. What happened tonight does not create a debt between us. Richard looked genuinely puzzled. You do not want anything? I wanted you to check the paperwork. That cannot be all. Maya studied him. That is part of your problem. Richard said nothing. You think everyone enters a room wanting something from whoever has the most money. Sometimes people are just trying to do the right thing. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Richard looked toward the window. Why did you never tell anyone about your family? Maya thought about Marcus, the wooden box, the unopened envelopes, and the lessons disguised as grocery math. Because I barely knew the truth myself. But even if I had known, why should I have needed it? Richard turned back. Maya held his gaze. If I had told you at the beginning that my grandfather controlled billions of dollars, would you have treated me differently? Richard did not answer. He did not have to. That is exactly why it matters, Maya said. I wanted to know who you were when you thought I was nobody. Richard's face changed. There was no boardroom defense for that sentence. No lawyer could rewrite it. No money could purchase a better answer. He had spent his life believing power revealed importance. That night, power revealed character instead. Maya picked up her cloth and returned to the table. Richard walked toward the door, then stopped. Miss Brooks. She looked up. Thank you. Maya gave him a small nod. Good night, Mr. Whitmore. He left without another word. The secret had been worth $10 billion on paper, but Richard finally understood that he had been wrong long before anyone mentioned the money. Maya's intelligence had not come from inheritance. Her dignity had not come from a famous family. Her worth had never depended on whether a billionaire recognized it. He had entered Sterling House believing the most powerful person was the one who could price everything in the room. He left understanding that the things worth respecting most were often the things money could never measure. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Hidden Table and join a community that believes true character is revealed not by power or status, but by courage, integrity, and kindness. Thank you for watching, and until next time, we'll save you a seat at the Hidden Tables.